"You don't belong here, boy. Get on the ground now," Officer Justin Foster screamed, slamming the black man against the marble wall of First National Bank. What he didn't know was that the man he was humiliating in front of dozens of witnesses was federal Judge Samuel Pierce, the same judge who would decide Foster's fate in federal court just 72 hours later. The morning had started peacefully enough at First National Bank. The Tuesday rush had settled into its predictable rhythm. Business people hurrying through transactions, elderly customers taking their time at teller windows, the soft hum of financial business conducted in marble and gold surroundings that whispered respectability and order. Samuel Pierce had entered the bank at exactly 10:47 a.m., his custom Navy suit impeccable as always, briefcase in hand. At 52, Pierce carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from a lifetime of earning respect in rooms where he was often the only black face. His silver-touched temples and measured stride spoke of a man who had learned that true authority rarely needed to announce itself. He approached the premier banking counter, the section reserved for high-value accounts and institutional clients. The marble floors reflected the morning light streaming through tall windows, creating an atmosphere of calm prosperity. Pierce set his briefcase down carefully and began reviewing documents for a significant transaction, funds for a judicial education foundation he was establishing. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the senior banking associate, greeted him with genuine warmth. She had handled Pierce's accounts for 3 years, had processed his mortgage for the house in Riverside Heights, had watched his financial portfolio grow with each careful investment. To her, he was Dr. Pierce, the law professor who had recently received some kind of important appointment she didn't fully understand but knew was significant. "Good morning, Dr. Pierce. How may we assist you today?" "Good morning, Eleanor. I need to establish the foundation account we discussed last week. The papers should be ready for signature." As Pierce reviewed the documents, 3 teller stations away, a commotion was brewing. A nervous customer had called police 20 minutes earlier, reporting a suspicious black man in an expensive suit who had been casing the bank for several minutes. The caller, Mrs. Betty Harrison, a woman whose anxieties about crime had been carefully cultivated by decades of local news consumption, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "He just doesn't look like he belongs here," she had whispered into her phone. "He's acting too confident, like he owns the place. You know what I mean?" The dispatcher, following protocol, had sent the nearest patrol unit. Officer Justin Foster was having a particularly aggressive morning. His coffee had been cold. His shift supervisor had questioned one of his reports, and his wife had started another argument about his drinking. Foster was 34 years old, 15 years on the force, and had cultivated a reputation as someone who didn't take any nonsense from anybody, especially from people who didn't know their place. When Foster received the call, his mood darkened further. Suspicious black male was code he understood perfectly. In his world, black men in expensive suits were either criminals or trying to be something they weren't. Either way, they needed to be put in their place. Foster parked his patrol car directly in front of the bank's main entrance, leaving the lights flashing. He wanted everyone to know that law enforcement was handling a situation. He checked his gun, adjusted his belt, and walked into the bank with the swagger of a man who believed his badge made him the ultimate authority in any room he entered. The bank's atmosphere changed the moment Foster stepped through the doors. Conversations quieted. Customers glanced nervously at the uniformed officer scanning the room like a predator seeking prey. The soft hum of normal business was replaced by the tension that always accompanied unexpected police presence. Foster's eyes locked onto Pierce immediately. There he was, a black man in an expensive suit, acting comfortable in a space where Foster believed he had no right to be. The sight triggered something primal in Foster's worldview. Everything about Pierce's demeanor offended him. The confident posture, the quality of his clothing, the way he spoke to the bank associate as an equal. Pierce was signing the final documents when he became aware of someone approaching behind him. He had developed a sixth sense about hostile attention over the years, a survival skill learned in childhood and refined through decades of navigating predominantly white professional spaces. Without turning around, he knew that someone was studying him with unfriendly eyes. "Excuse me." Foster's voice cut through the bank's quiet atmosphere like a blade. I need to see some identification. Pierce turned slowly, taking in the officer's aggressive stance, the hand resting on his service weapon, the barely contained hostility in his eyes. Pierce had been in this situation before. Not exactly this situation, but variations of it. The assumption of criminality, the challenge to his right to exist in spaces of privilege, the demand that he prove his worthiness to breathe the same air as white people. "I'm conducting business with my bank," Pierce replied calmly, his voice carrying the measured tone that had served him well in countless courtrooms. "Is there a problem, officer?" Foster's face flushed red. The calm response, the lack of deference, the way this man spoke to him, as if they were equals. It was everything Foster hated about what he saw as the changing world order. In Foster's mind, black men were supposed to be intimidated by police uniforms. They were supposed to stammer and sweat, and immediately produce whatever documentation was demanded. "I said, show me your ID, boy." Foster stepped closer, invading Pierce's personal space. "We got a call about someone suspicious casing this bank." The word boy hung in the air like poison gas. Every person within earshot felt the sting of it. Mrs. Hartwell's hand flew to her mouth. An elderly white businessman at the next counter froze mid-signature. A young mother pulling money from the ATM gathered her child closer. Pierce felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with public racial humiliation. But he had trained himself never to react to provocations in public. Losing composure would only confirm the stereotypes that men like Foster carried like weapons. Instead, Pierce reached slowly into his jacket pocket. "Officer, I'm happy to show you identification. I'm Dr. Samuel Pierce, and I don't care what you call yourself," Foster interrupted, grabbing Pierce's wrist as he reached for his wallet. "You could be carrying fake IDs, drugs, weapons. Turn around and put your hands on the counter." The bank erupted in shocked murmurs. This wasn't a police procedure anyone recognized. This was theater, a public demonstration of racial dominance disguised as law enforcement. Several customers had their phones out now, recognizing that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. Pierce weighed his options carefully. He could assert his authority, reveal his position, end this humiliation immediately, but doing so would only confirm Foster's suspicion that he was somehow different from other black men, somehow more deserving of respect. Pierce understood that every black man who couldn't pull out a federal judgeship deserved the same dignity that Foster was denying him. "Officer, I'm complying with your request," Pierce said quietly, placing his hands on the marble counter. "But I want you to know that this treatment is inappropriate and likely illegal." Foster's rage exploded at what he perceived as backtalk. "You think you're some kind of lawyer, boy? You think you know the law better than me?" The irony would have been comedic if it weren't so tragic. Pierce had spent 25 years studying, teaching, and practicing law. He had argued before state supreme courts and federal appellate panels. In 72 hours, he would be sworn in as a federal judge with lifetime tenure. But at this moment, he was just another black man being humiliated by a racist cop. Foster began an aggressive pat-down, his hands rough and intrusive, designed more to degrade than to search for weapons. He made sure every movement was visible to the other customers, a performance of power that said, "This is what happens when people like this try to act above their station." "Justin, what are you doing?" Detective Maria Santos had entered the bank and was staring at the scene in horror. Santos was Foster's partner, a 10-year veteran who had watched Foster's behavior grow more aggressive and overtly racist over the past 2 years. She had filed informal complaints that were ignored, had tried to counsel him privately, had watched in dismay as the department protected him because his arrest numbers were good. "I'm handling a suspicious person complaint," Foster replied, without taking his hands off Pierce. Guy was casing the bank, acting suspicious. Santos looked around the bank, taking in the shocked faces of customers and employees. She saw Mrs. Hartwell shaking her head frantically, trying to signal that this was a mistake. She saw the phones recording, the viral video being created in real time. She understood immediately that Foster had created a disaster. "Justin, let him go. Now, don't tell me how to do my job, Santos. This guy could be armed, could be planning a robbery. Pierce remained perfectly still during this exchange, but his mind was racing. He was cataloging every detail: the time, the witnesses, the nature of Foster's language, the excessive force of the search. He was also noting Santos's obvious discomfort, the way other officers would later be forced to choose between backing Foster's story or telling the truth. Foster found Pierce's wallet and began examining his identification with theatrical suspicion. "Dr. Samuel Pierce," he read aloud, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Georgetown University Law. Real fancy. You think fancy degrees make you better than regular people, doctor?" "I think all people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, Officer Foster," Pierce replied, reading the name tag on Foster's uniform, regardless of their education or background. Foster's face went purple. The calm response, the refusal to be baited into anger, the way this man continued to speak as if he had rights, it was driving him to rage. Foster had expected fear, submission, the satisfaction of watching another uppity black man learn his place. Instead, he was facing someone who seemed untouchable by his usual intimidation tactics. "Smart mouth, huh? You think you're clever?" Foster shoved Pierce harder against the counter. "You don't belong here, boy. Get on the ground now." The command exploded through the bank like a gunshot. This was the moment when verbal harassment transformed into physical assault, when a bad situation became a potential lawsuit, when a racist cop's career should have ended. Pierce felt Foster's hands on his shoulders, felt the pressure trying to force him to his knees in front of dozens of witnesses. Every fiber of his being wanted to resist, to assert his authority, to end this humiliation immediately. But Pierce understood something that Foster didn't. This moment wasn't about him personally. It was about every black man who had ever been forced to endure this treatment without recourse. Every person who couldn't fight back because they lacked the protection of position and privilege. So Pierce allowed himself to be forced to his knees on the marble floor of First National Bank. He kept his hands visible, his movements slow and non-threatening. He looked up at Foster with eyes that held no fear, no hatred, only a kind of sad recognition of what this moment revealed about the world they lived in. The bank had gone completely silent. The only sounds were the hum of air conditioning and the distant traffic outside. Every person present understood they were witnessing something profound and horrible, the ritual humiliation of a human being for the crime of existing while black. Foster produced his handcuffs with theatrical flourish. "Samuel Pierce, you're under arrest for trespassing, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest." "On what grounds?" Pierce asked quietly. "On the grounds that I'm a police officer and you're not." Santos stepped forward desperately. "Justin, don't do this. You're making a mistake. The only mistake is letting people like this think they can go wherever they want and do whatever they want. Time for a reality check." Foster cuffed Pierce's hands behind his back, using more force than necessary, making sure the metal bit into his wrists. He hauled Pierce to his feet and began marching him toward the door, past the horrified faces of customers and employees, past the phones recording his every move, past the evidence of his own moral bankruptcy. As they reached the door, Pierce turned back toward Mrs. Hartwell, who was standing behind the counter with tears streaming down her face. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "please call my office and let them know I'll be delayed. The number is in my file." The simple dignity of that statement, treating his arrest as merely an inconvenience, maintaining his courtesy, even while being degraded, hit the room like a physical blow. Here was a man who understood that his character would be defined not by what was done to him, but by how he responded to what was done to him. Foster shoved Pierce toward the patrol car, past the growing crowd of onlookers, past the phones capturing every moment of his brutality. He was too enraged to notice the faces around him, too caught up in his performance of dominance to realize that he was destroying himself with every action. As Foster pushed Pierce into the back of the patrol car, one of the bank customers, a young lawyer named Jennifer Mills, approached Santos. "Officer, I witnessed that entire incident. That man did nothing wrong. He was conducting legitimate business, and your partner assaulted him without cause." Santos looked at Mills with exhausted eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, Please make sure you're available if there's an investigation." "Oh, there'll be an investigation," Mills replied, holding up her phone. "Because I recorded everything, and I'm an attorney with the ACLU." Santos closed her eyes and shook her head. She had tried to stop this disaster, had seen it coming from the moment Foster walked into the bank. Now all she could do was distance herself from the wreckage and hope her career survived Foster's spectacular self-destruction. In the back of the patrol car, Pierce sat quietly as Foster drove him toward the station. He wasn't thinking about revenge or retribution. He was thinking about the foundation he had been trying to establish, the one designed to provide legal education for underserved communities. He was thinking about the irony that in 72 hours, he would be sworn in as a federal judge, wielding the very authority that Foster believed belonged only to people like himself. Pierce was also thinking about Marcus Cole, the defense attorney who would soon be representing Officer Justin Foster in federal court on corruption charges. Cole had no idea that his client had just provided the prosecution with perfect character evidence. Foster's federal trial would now include video of him racially profiling and assaulting a federal judge. But most of all, Pierce was thinking about the look in Foster's eyes, the genuine belief that his badge gave him the right to degrade human beings based on their skin color. Pierce had seen that look before, in courtrooms across the country, in the eyes of defendants who genuinely couldn't understand why their actions were wrong. Justice, Pierce knew, wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, and the truth had just been recorded in high definition by a dozen witnesses. The truth would soon speak for itself in the courtroom, where Pierce would sit, not as a victim, but as the final arbiter of justice. Foster pulled into the police station parking lot, still muttering about uppity blacks who needed to learn their place. He had no idea that he had just humiliated the man who would soon hold his future in his hands. He had no idea that justice, like truth, had a way of making itself known. As Pierce was led into the station for booking, he said a silent prayer, not for revenge against Foster, but for the wisdom to use his position to ensure that what had happened to him today would happen to fewer people tomorrow. The marble floor of First National Bank had been the stage for Foster's performance of racial dominance. In 72 hours, the marble floors of the federal courthouse would become the stage for something far more powerful, the performance of justice itself. Foster's career was about to collide with the very system he thought protected him, and Samuel Pierce, the man he had just degraded and dehumanized, would be the one holding the gavel when that collision occurred. Justice was coming. It just didn't know it yet. The Charleston Police Department's main precinct buzzed with its usual midday energy as Officer Justin Foster walked through the doors, his chest puffed with the satisfaction of a job well done. The arrest paperwork tucked under his arm represented what he considered a textbook example of proactive policing, identifying a threat before it materialized and neutralizing it with appropriate force. "Foster," Sergeant Mike Donovan called out from behind the duty desk, his weathered face breaking into an approving grin. "Heard you handled some business at First National this morning. Good work." Foster dropped the paperwork on Donovan's desk with theatrical flair. "Just another day cleaning up the streets, Sarge. Some people need to learn their place. You know what I mean?" Donovan scanned the arrest report, nodding approvingly at the charges: trespassing, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. All misdemeanors, all vague enough to stick, all standard procedure for what the department unofficially called attitude adjustments. The charges were designed not to secure convictions, but to send messages to make certain people understand that they existed in society at the pleasure of law enforcement. "Dr. Samuel Pierce," Donovan read aloud, chuckling at the formal title. "Let me guess. Another one of those educated types who think their fancy degrees make them special." "You got it," Foster replied, settling into a chair with the casual confidence of a man whose actions had never faced serious consequences. Walking around that bank like he owned the place, acting all superior, talking down to me like I was the help. Had to remind him that the badge trumps the diploma every time. Detective Maria Santos entered the common area, her face tight with barely controlled anger. She had spent the 20-minute drive back to the station trying to process what she had witnessed, trying to find some way to justify her partner's actions. But no matter how she approached it, she kept reaching the same conclusion. Foster had committed assault under color of authority, and she had watched it happen. "Justin, we need to talk," Santos said quietly, pulling him aside toward an empty interview room. Foster's mood darkened. He had expected congratulations, war stories, the usual camaraderie that followed a successful arrest. Santos's serious tone suggested something else entirely: criticism, doubt, the kind of questioning that Foster had learned to shut down quickly. "What's the problem, Santos? You saw what happened. Guy was acting suspicious, refused to cooperate, got aggressive when I tried to search him. Textbook arrest." Santos closed the interview room door and faced her partner directly. "Justin, that man wasn't doing anything wrong. He was a legitimate customer, conducting business with his bank. Mrs. Hartwell confirmed he's had accounts there for years." Foster's face flushed with familiar anger. "Since when do we take the word of bank employees over police officers? You're supposed to have my back, Santos, not question my judgment." "Having your back doesn't mean staying silent when you're wrong. That man didn't resist arrest. He complied with every command. You forced him to the ground for no reason except that you didn't like his attitude." Foster stepped closer to Santos, using his physical presence to intimidate. It was a tactic he employed instinctively when his authority was challenged, regardless of the gender or rank of the challenger. "My attitude?" He was the one with the attitude, Santos, acting like he was better than everyone else, talking down to a police officer. Sometimes people need to be reminded of reality. Santos held her ground, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. She had been down this road with Foster before: the escalating aggression, the veiled threats, the department's willingness to protect him at the expense of everyone else. "Justin, there are going to be complaints. Multiple witnesses recorded the incident. The bank has security cameras. This isn't going away quietly." Foster laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the interview room walls. "Let them complain. Let them file their little reports and write their angry letters. You know what happens to complaints against me? They get filed in the circular filing cabinet, just like they always do." He wasn't wrong. Foster's personnel file contained 47 complaints filed over his 15-year career. Excessive force, racial profiling, verbal abuse, illegal searches. 47 complaints that had been investigated by his colleagues, reviewed by his supervisors, and dismissed as unfounded or unprovable. The department had developed a systematic approach to protecting officers like Foster: delay investigations until witnesses disappeared, question complainants aggressively enough to discourage follow-up, and create enough bureaucratic obstacles to exhaust anyone seeking accountability. Santos knew the system as well as Foster did. She had watched good officers resign in disgust, had seen community members stop calling for help because they feared the police more than the criminals. But she also knew that this time might be different. The phones recording at the bank, the clear video evidence, the obvious disparity between Foster's report and reality. It would be harder to make this disappear. "This time is different. Justin, you assaulted someone in front of dozens of witnesses. You can't paper over video evidence." Foster's expression turned cold, calculating. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of someone who had learned that threats were more effective when delivered softly. "Santos, you've been my partner for 2 years. In that time, have I ever failed to back you up? Have I ever left you hanging when things got rough?" The implicit threat was clear: continue questioning his actions, and that support would disappear. In the dangerous, insular world of police work, losing your partner's support could be a career-ending catastrophe. Santos felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came with moral compromise, the slow erosion of principles that had been eating at her for months. "Justin, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to help you understand that this situation is different. The man you arrested, there was something about him, the way he handled himself, the way he spoke. I think we might have made a serious mistake."
Foster's laugh was genuinely amused now.
"A mistake? The only mistake was letting people like him think they can go anywhere they want without consequences. Santos, you're a good cop, but sometimes you're too soft. This job requires hard decisions and harder actions." Before Santos could respond, Internal Affairs Sergeant Patricia Reeves, knocked on the interview room door. Reeves was a 20-year veteran who had built her reputation on finding ways to clear officers of misconduct allegations while maintaining the appearance of thorough investigation. She was the department's insurance policy against accountability, the bureaucratic firewall that protected the system from external scrutiny.
Foster, I need to speak with you about this morning's incident at First National Bank.
Foster straightened up, his confidence returning. Reeves's involvement meant the department was already working to contain the situation, already building the narrative that would justify his actions. Sergeant Reeves, happy to discuss it. Routine arrest of a suspicious individual who was acting erratically and refused to cooperate. Reeves opened a thin folder containing preliminary reports from the scene. Foster, we've received several complaints about your conduct this morning. Allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and false arrest. I need to get your side of the story for the record. For the next hour, Foster provided his version of events with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to shape facts to fit conclusions. In his telling, Samuel Pierce had been acting suspiciously, had refused to identify himself, had become increasingly aggressive and threatening. Foster had used only the minimum force necessary to effect a lawful arrest, had followed all departmental procedures, had shown remarkable restraint in the face of obvious disrespect for law enforcement. Reeves took notes with bureaucratic precision, asking the kinds of follow-up questions that would later be cited as evidence of a thorough investigation. But anyone listening carefully would notice that her questions were designed to elicit justifications rather than facts, to build a defense rather than determine truth. Foster, were you aware that Mr. Pierce was conducting legitimate business at the bank? Sergeant, someone conducting legitimate business doesn't typically act nervous and evasive when approached by law enforcement. His behavior raised red flags that any experienced officer would recognize. Did you attempt to de-escalate the situation before making the arrest? I gave Mr. Pierce multiple opportunities to cooperate and comply with lawful orders. He chose confrontation over cooperation. In your professional opinion, was the use of force appropriate, given the circumstances? Absolutely. I used only the minimal force necessary to ensure Soar safety and effect a lawful arrest. Santos listened to this performance with growing dismay. She had been present for the incident, had witnessed Foster's escalating aggression, had seen Pierce's calm compliance with every demand. But Foster's version of events would become the official record, the basis for clearing him of any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in the elegant study of his Riverside Heights home, Samuel Pierce was making phone calls with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. He had been released from custody after 2 hours. The charges dropped when the bank manager arrived with security footage that contradicted every element of Foster's arrest report. Pierce's first call was to his assistant at the law school, informing her that he would need to reschedule his afternoon appointments. His second call was to the court administration office, confirming his schedule for Monday morning's swearing-in ceremony. His third call was to federal public defender Sarah Chen, alerting her to a potential conflict of interest in an upcoming case. Sarah, I need you to be aware of something that happened today. I was involved in an incident with a Charleston police officer named Justin Foster. If he becomes a defendant in any federal case, I'll need to recuse myself. Chen was surprised by Pierce's formal tone. They had worked together for years, and she had never heard him sound so carefully controlled. Samuel, what kind of incident? Are you okay? Pierce paused, choosing his words carefully.
I was arrested this morning while conducting business at my bank. The charges were dropped when video evidence contradicted the officer's report. I'm fine, but the incident was recorded by multiple witnesses and will likely generate media attention.
Chen understood immediately. As a public defender, she had seen countless cases of police misconduct, had watched officers lie under oath with the confidence of people who knew they would never face consequences. But she had also learned that police officers who victimized federal judges often found their careers taking unexpected turns. Samuel, do you want me to recommend someone to represent you in a civil lawsuit? That won't be necessary. I have confidence that the appropriate authorities will handle this matter according to law. The carefully neutral language spoke volumes. Pierce wasn't seeking revenge or monetary compensation. He was simply ensuring that the truth would be available when it was needed. And in 72 hours, when he took the oath as a federal judge, that truth would take on a power that Foster couldn't possibly imagine. Pierce's final call was to his wife, Dr. Angela Pierce, who was finishing her rounds at Charleston General Hospital. Angela was a cardiac surgeon, accustomed to life and death decisions, but nothing had prepared her for the rage she felt when her husband calmly described his morning's humiliation. They did what? Angela's voice carried the surgical precision that made her one of the most respected doctors in the state. Samuel, we're filing complaints with everyone. The FBI, the Justice Department, the ACLU. This cannot stand. Angela, I appreciate your anger, and I share it. But we need to handle this carefully. In 3 days, I'll be in a position to ensure that justice is served appropriately. Angela understood. Her husband's appointment to the federal bench had been confirmed just weeks earlier, the culmination of a distinguished legal career that had included arguing before the Supreme Court and teaching constitutional law at Georgetown. The irony that he had been brutalized by a police officer just days before ascending to the federal judiciary was almost too bitter to contemplate. Samuel, I need you to know that what happened today wasn't about you personally. It was about the system that protected that officer, the culture that made him think he could act with impunity. Pierce looked out his study window at the carefully manicured neighborhood where he had built his life through decades of hard work and careful achievement. He thought about the young black men who faced what he had faced today without the protection of position and privilege, who couldn't make phone calls to federal public defenders or rely on their reputations to secure their release. I know, Angela. And that's exactly why this matters. Justice isn't just about individual cases. It's about the precedents we set, the standards we enforce, the message we send about who has value in our society. Back at the Charleston Police Department, Foster was completing his paperwork with the satisfaction of someone whose version of events had been officially accepted. Sergeant Reeves had concluded her investigation with predictable efficiency, finding that Foster had acted appropriately given the circumstances, had used only reasonable force, and had conducted himself professionally throughout the incident. The complaints from bank witnesses had been noted and filed, with follow-up investigations to be conducted as resources permit. The bank's security footage had been requested but would likely be unavailable due to technical difficulties. The cell phone videos had been dismissed as incomplete and lacking context. Foster cleaned out his desk at the end of his shift, preparing for a long weekend before his scheduled appearance in federal court on Monday. He was facing corruption charges related to a completely separate incident, accepting bribes from drug dealers in exchange for advance warning about raids. His lawyer, Marcus Cole, had assured him that the case was winnable, that federal prosecutors rarely convicted police officers, that his record of proactive law enforcement would work in his favor. Foster had no idea that his record now included video evidence of him racially profiling and assaulting a federal judge. He had no idea that the man he had forced to his knees on marble floors would soon be sitting behind a bench, holding a gavel that could end his career forever. As Foster drove home that evening, he was thinking about his testimony on Monday, about how to present himself as a dedicated officer who had been falsely accused by criminals seeking revenge. He was thinking about his pension, his benefits, his future in law enforcement. He wasn't thinking about Samuel Pierce at all. In Foster's world, black men who got arrested were footnotes, not main characters. They were problems solved, not people remembered. But in 3 days, Foster would learn that some footnotes become headlines, that some problems become solutions, and that justice has a way of remembering everything, especially the things we choose to forget. The system that had protected Foster for 15 years was about to meet the system that would hold him accountable, and the man he had humiliated would be the one holding the scales when those systems collided. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that Charleston residents had learned to appreciate before the summer heat descended. 3 men woke up in different parts of the city, each preparing for Monday's federal court appearance in ways that would have seemed ironically impossible just days earlier. Officer Justin Foster rolled out of bed at 6:30 a.m., his mood buoyant for the first time in weeks. The successful resolution of Thursday's bank incident had restored his confidence in the natural order of things, his ability to maintain control, the department's willingness to protect him, and the system's recognition that some people needed to be kept in their place. Foster's wife, Karen, was already in the kitchen making coffee when he wandered downstairs in his boxer shorts and a police academy t-shirt that had grown tight around his expanding waistline. Karen had learned over their 12 years of marriage to read her husband's moods by the way he carried himself, and this morning she could see the swagger returning to his step. "Feeling better about Monday?" she asked, handing him a mug with "World's Greatest Cop" printed on the side, a gift from his mother-in-law who believed firmly that police officers could do no wrong. "Much better," Foster replied, settling into his favorite recliner with the sports section of the Charleston Post and Courier. "Yesterday reminded me why I'm good at this job. Sometimes you have to show people that actions have consequences." Karen nodded absently while scrolling through her Facebook feed. She had stopped asking for details about Justin's work years ago, after too many stories that made her uncomfortable. It was easier to maintain the fiction that her husband was protecting and serving rather than confronting the reality of what proactive policing actually meant. "Marcus called yesterday," she mentioned casually. "He wants to go over your testimony again this weekend?" Foster grunted dismissively. Marcus Cole was a good lawyer, but he worried too much about details that didn't matter. Federal prosecutors were just bureaucrats in suits, and federal judges were political appointees who understood that law enforcement deserved respect. The corruption charges against him were flimsy, testimony from drug dealers who would say anything to reduce their sentences, financial records that could be explained as legitimate compensation for overtime work. "Cole needs to relax. This case is about credibility, and I've got 15 years of good arrests and commendations. The prosecution's got a bunch of criminals pointing fingers and trying to bring down a good cop." What Foster didn't mention because he didn't know was that his good arrests included a disproportionate number of black defendants, many of whom had been convicted based on Foster's testimony alone. His commendations had been awarded by supervisors who valued arrest numbers over constitutional rights, and his legitimate compensation included $30,000 in cash payments from dealers who had paid for advance warning about police raids. Across town in the federal building, Samuel Pierce was already at work despite the early hour. He had been appointed to chambers on the 15th floor, a suite of offices that overlooked Charleston Harbor and provided a view of Fort Sumter in the distance. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. From this office, he would preside over cases in a city where the Civil War had begun, where federal authority had once been rejected, where the arc of justice had bent slowly but inevitably toward equality. Pierce's assistant, Margaret Chen, had arrived even earlier to prepare briefing materials for his first week of cases. Margaret was a Harvard Law graduate who had clerked for Pierce during his teaching years at Georgetown, and she understood that his transition from academic to judge required meticulous preparation. "Judge Pierce," she said, using his new title with obvious pride, "I've prepared summaries of Monday's docket, 3 criminal cases, 2 civil matters, and 1 sentencing hearing." Pierce accepted the files with the careful attention he brought to every aspect of his work. At 52, he had learned that excellence was a habit rather than an accident, that the difference between good and great lay in the details that others overlooked. The first file was labeled United States v. Justin Foster, and Pierce opened it with the same professional detachment he would bring to any case. The charges were serious: conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice. The defendant was a 15-year veteran of the Charleston Police Department with commendations for community service and arrest productivity. Pierce read through the prosecution's evidence summary, noting the witness statements, financial records, and surveillance footage that formed the foundation of their case. It was a solid prosecution built on multiple sources of evidence, the kind of case that federal prosecutors only brought when they were confident of conviction. What Pierce didn't yet realize, because the bank incident had occurred after the case files were prepared, was that he was reading about the same Justin Foster who had forced him to his knees on marble floors 2 days earlier. The administrative wheels of justice moved slowly, and Thursday's arrest report wouldn't reach the federal court system for several days. Pierce set the Foster file aside and continued reviewing his docket. Judge Harriet Morrison, the chief judge who had recommended him for appointment, had warned him that his first cases would be closely watched by court staff, attorneys, and media. Federal judges enjoyed lifetime tenure precisely because they were expected to make difficult decisions without political pressure, but that independence came with the weight of enormous responsibility. Margaret, has there been any media attention to my appointment? Some coverage in the legal press, and the Post and Courier ran a profile piece last week. Generally positive, they emphasized your academic credentials and experience arguing before appellate courts. Pierce nodded, appreciating that his transition to the bench had been relatively smooth. Some judicial appointments generated controversy, particularly when they involved candidates who brought diverse perspectives to courts that had been historically homogeneous. Pierce's sterling academic credentials and bipartisan support had minimized political opposition, but he understood that his real test would come in how he handled his cases. Margaret, I want you to know that I expect to be held to the highest standards of judicial conduct. If you ever see anything that concerns you, any appearance of bias, any procedural irregularity, any behavior that compromises the integrity of this court, I want you to bring it to my attention immediately. Margaret had worked for federal judges before, and she recognized something special in Pierce's approach. Many judges viewed their position as a reward for past achievements, an opportunity to wield power over attorneys who had once been their peers. Pierce seemed to understand that judicial authority was a trust that had to be earned daily through fair and competent decision-making. Meanwhile, on the other side of Charleston, defense attorney Marcus Cole was having a very different kind of morning. Cole had built his career representing police officers accused of misconduct, and he understood better than anyone how to navigate the intersection of law enforcement and federal prosecution. His track record was impressive: acquittals in cases that seemed unwinnable, plea agreements that minimized penalties, hung juries that forced prosecutors to accept lesser charges. But Justin Foster was becoming a problem that Cole's usual strategies couldn't solve. Cole's office overlooked Marion Square, and he often found himself staring out the window when cases became complicated. This morning, he was reviewing Foster's case file for the dozenth time, looking for weaknesses in the prosecution's evidence that he might have missed. The problem wasn't the evidence. Cole had seen stronger cases result in acquittals when the defendant wore a police uniform. The problem was Foster himself, whose arrogance and obvious racism made him nearly impossible to present sympathetically to a jury. Cole's phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed Charleston PD, Internal Affairs. Marcus, this is Sergeant Reeves. We need to discuss your client. Cole felt his stomach tighten. Calls from Internal Affairs usually meant that his client had done something stupid between indictment and trial, creating new evidence for prosecutors to exploit. What happened, Patricia? Foster was involved in an incident Thursday morning at First National Bank, arrested a black man for suspicious behavior, but the charges were dropped when bank security footage contradicted his report. Cole closed his eyes and massaged his temples. How bad is it? Could be worse. We've contained the situation internally, and the complainant hasn't hired an attorney or filed a federal lawsuit. But there's video footage from bystanders that's circulating on social media. Cole opened his laptop and quickly found the videos that Reeves mentioned. The footage was damning, clear evidence of Foster racially profiling a well-dressed black man, escalating a routine interaction into a physical confrontation, and ultimately arresting someone who had done nothing wrong. Patricia, who was the victim, some professor named Samuel Pierce, Georgetown Law, real academic type, thinks he's better than everyone else. Cole made notes while Reeves spoke, but his mind was racing through the implications for Foster's federal case. Character evidence was rarely admissible in criminal trials, but prosecutors had ways of introducing defendant behavior that demonstrated consciousness of guilt or pattern of misconduct. Is Pierce likely to testify in the federal case? No connection between the incidents. Thursday was a routine arrest that got blown out of proportion by liberal media and activist groups. Cole ended the call, feeling worse than when it began. Reeves's casual dismissal of the incident suggested that she didn't understand its significance. Federal prosecutors were experts at finding connections between seemingly unrelated events, at building narratives that demonstrated defendants' true character. Cole spent the rest of the morning drafting strategy memos and preparing for his weekend meeting with Foster. He needed to convince his client to accept a plea agreement before prosecutors discovered the bank incident and used it to destroy his credibility. At 11:30 a.m., Cole's secretary buzzed his intercom. "Mr. Cole, Judge Morrison's chambers called. There's been a change in the assignment for Monday's Foster trial." Cole felt another surge of anxiety. Judge Morrison was tough but fair, someone who understood law enforcement and gave police officers the benefit of the doubt. If she was being replaced, it could signal that the case was being transferred to a judge with different perspectives on police misconduct. What kind of change? "Judge Morrison has a family emergency and won't be available. The case is being reassigned to Judge Samuel Pierce." Cole wrote down the name without recognition. New federal judges were appointed regularly, and he made it a practice to research their backgrounds before appearing in their courtrooms. He made a note to pull Pierce's biography and recent decisions. "Do we know anything about Judge Pierce's background? I can research it this afternoon and have a memo ready by Monday morning." Cole agreed and returned to his case preparation, unaware that he had just learned the name of the man his client had assaulted 2 days earlier. The wheels of justice were turning with clockwork precision, bringing together 3 lives that had intersected in ways none of them yet understood. At 2 p.m., Foster arrived at Cole's office for their scheduled strategy session. He was wearing his dress uniform, the one reserved for court appearances and formal occasions, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed that presentation was more important than substance. "Marcus, good to see you. Ready to get this nonsense behind us?" Cole gestured for Foster to sit down, noting the swagger in his walk and the dismissive tone in his voice. Foster's attitude might play well with fellow officers, but it would be disastrous in front of a federal jury. "Justin, we need to talk about your testimony and how you're going to present yourself in court. Federal judges and juries have different expectations than what you're used to." Foster settled into his chair with obvious impatience. "Marcus, I've testified hundreds of times. I know how to handle myself in a courtroom." "This is different, Justin. You're the defendant now, not a witness. Everything about your demeanor, your word choice, your attitude toward the court will be scrutinized." Cole spent the next hour walking Foster through potential cross-examination questions, coaching him on how to respond to prosecutorial attacks on his credibility. But every answer Foster gave revealed the same underlying problem. He genuinely believed that police officers deserved special treatment from the justice system. "Justin, when the prosecutor asks about the money you received from informants, you need to sound remorseful, not defensive." "Why should I sound remorseful for doing my job? Informants pay for information all the time. It's standard operating procedure. Because you didn't report the payments as required by department policy, and you used the information to help dealers avoid arrest." Foster's face reddened with familiar anger. "Those dealers were criminals, Marcus. They were going to be arrested eventually anyway. I just provided them with information they could have gotten from other sources." Cole realized that Foster genuinely couldn't see the problem with his actions. In Foster's worldview, police officers were entitled to supplement their income however they chose, and criminals had no right to complain about corruption. "Justin, I need you to understand something. The federal prosecutors on this case are experienced, intelligent, and completely committed to winning. They're going to try to make you look like a corrupt cop who sold out his oath for money. Let them try. I've got 15 years of commendations and good arrests. My record speaks for itself." Cole decided not to mention the bank incident unless it became necessary. Foster was already defensive enough, and knowing that his recent behavior might become evidence would only make him more volatile. "Who's the judge on this case?" Foster asked. "Judge Samuel Pierce. He's new to the federal bench, just appointed. I'm researching his background this weekend." Foster nodded absently, the name meaning nothing to him. In his experience, judges were either law and order types who supported police or liberal activists who hated law enforcement. He would know which category Pierce fell into as soon as he saw him. The meeting concluded with Cole feeling more pessimistic than ever about Foster's chances. His client was arrogant, unrepentant, and completely unaware of how his behavior appeared to people outside law enforcement. The federal prosecutors would destroy him on cross-examination, and a conviction seemed inevitable. As Foster left Cole's office, he was thinking about Monday's trial as an inconvenience that would soon be behind him. He planned to spend the weekend relaxing, watching football, and preparing mentally for what he expected to be a routine victory over federal bureaucrats who didn't understand real police work. Foster had no idea that 65 floors above him, Judge Samuel Pierce was reviewing case files and preparing for his first week on the federal bench. He had no idea that the professor he had humiliated at First National Bank was now Judge Pierce, the man who would decide his fate. And he certainly had no idea that justice sometimes moved in circles, that actions had consequences, and that the marble floors, where he had forced a black man to his knees, were about to become the stage for the most important performance of his life. Monday morning was 72 hours away. 3 men were preparing for a collision that would test everything they believed about law, justice, and the price of power. Only one of them knew what was coming. Sunday evening settled over Charleston with the golden light that photographers loved and residents had learned to treasure. The city's historic district was quiet, except for the occasional horse-drawn carriage carrying tourists through streets that had witnessed 3 centuries of American history. Tomorrow would bring another chapter to that history, though none of the participants yet understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. In his modest ranch house on the west side of town, Officer Justin Foster was enjoying what he considered a well-deserved evening of relaxation. The weekend had passed peacefully, college football on Saturday, church with Karen on Sunday morning, and an afternoon of yard work that had left him feeling productive and centered. Tomorrow's trial was the last obstacle between him and the vindication he believed he deserved. Foster sat in his recliner, a beer in one hand and the television remote in the other, surfing between ESPN highlights and a police drama that portrayed cops as heroes fighting an endless war against urban decay. Karen was in the kitchen, preparing his lucky meal, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, the same dinner she had made before every important day of his career. "Honey, you nervous about tomorrow?" Karen called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness she used when discussing topics that made her uncomfortable. "Nervous? Hell no," Foster replied, taking a long pull from his beer. "Excited, maybe, ready to show these federal prosecutors what happens when they try to take down a good cop." Foster had spent Sunday afternoon polishing his dress uniform until every button gleamed. Every crease was razor sharp. Every element of his appearance projected the authority and professionalism that he believed would impress the jury. He had practiced his testimony in the mirror, perfecting the confident delivery that had served him well in hundreds of previous court appearances. The beer was helping him relax, softening the edges of anxiety that had been building for weeks. Foster wasn't worried about the evidence. He had explanations for everything the prosecutors might present. The cash payments from dealers were compensation for information that helped solve other crimes. The advance warnings about raids were tactical decisions designed to prevent violence. His actions had always been motivated by legitimate law enforcement purposes. "Karen, bring me another beer, would you?" Karen appeared in the doorway, holding a fresh bottle, but not moving to deliver it. "Justin, maybe you should take it easy tonight. You want to be sharp tomorrow." Foster's mood darkened slightly. "One beer isn't going to hurt anything. Besides, I need to relax. Tomorrow's going to be a long day of listening to criminals lie about a good cop." Karen brought him the beer, but remained standing beside his chair, something clearly weighing on her mind. After 12 years of marriage, she had learned to read the signs of her husband's escalating anger, had developed strategies for managing his moods that usually kept their home peaceful. "Justin, I've been thinking about what happens after tomorrow. Win or lose, maybe it's time to consider a change. Maybe apply for detective, or look into security work, or win or lose, Foster's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Karen, there's no losing here. I'm going to walk out of that courthouse tomorrow, cleared of all charges, and then I'm going back to work, doing what I've always done, protecting this community from people who want to destroy it." Foster took a longer drink, his mind already moving to the celebration he planned for tomorrow evening. Drinks with fellow officers, war stories about federal prosecutors who didn't understand real police work, maybe a steak dinner at the restaurant where cops got discounts. By Wednesday, this whole nightmare would be a memory. What Foster didn't know, couldn't know, was that 3 miles away, Judge Samuel Pierce was conducting his own Sunday evening ritual of preparation. Pierce believed that every day in court was a sacred trust, an opportunity to demonstrate that justice could be both fair and decisive. Tomorrow would be his first criminal trial as a federal judge, and he was determined to prove worthy of the appointment. Pierce sat in his home study, surrounded by law books that represented decades of careful scholarship and practical experience. The room was elegantly appointed, but not ostentatious. Leather-bound volumes of federal reporters, an antique oak desk that had belonged to his grandfather, and photographs that documented his journey from civil rights lawyer to federal judge. Margaret had prepared detailed briefing materials for tomorrow's cases, including background information on attorneys, procedural histories, and relevant case law. Pierce was reviewing these materials with the methodical attention that had made him one of Georgetown's most respected constitutional law professors. The file labeled United States v. Justin Foster lay open on his desk, and Pierce was studying the prosecution's witness list when something caught his attention. Several witnesses were listed as bank employees and customers, scheduled to testify about character evidence related to recent defendant behavior. Pierce made a note to research the admissibility standards for such evidence, though he suspected the prosecution was building a pattern of conduct argument that would require careful judicial management. Character evidence could be powerfully persuasive, but it also carried the risk of unfair prejudice that could undermine a defendant's right to a fair trial. "Samuel, you've been in there for 3 hours. Dr. Angela Pierce called from the kitchen. Come have some tea and tell me about tomorrow." Pierce set down his reading glasses and joined his wife in the kitchen, where she was preparing chamomile tea, their Sunday evening tradition for the past 15 years. Angela was still in her scrubs from a day of emergency surgeries at Charleston General, but she had insisted on maintaining their weekly ritual despite her exhaustion. "How are you feeling about your first criminal trial?" Angela asked, settling into the breakfast nook that overlooked their garden. "Nervous, honestly. Criminal cases are different from the civil matters I'm used to. The stakes are higher. People's liberty, their futures, their families. I want to make sure I get it right." Angela studied her husband's face, noting the careful concentration that he brought to every challenge. She had watched him prepare for Supreme Court arguments with the same meticulous attention, had seen him spend weeks researching obscure precedents that might influence a single paragraph of legal reasoning. "Tell me about the case." "Police corruption charges. Officer accused of taking bribes from drug dealers in exchange for advance warning about raids. The evidence seems substantial. Financial records, witness testimony, surveillance footage." Pierce paused, considering how much to share about his judicial deliberations. Even with Angela, he was careful to maintain the boundaries that judicial ethics required. The defendant has 15 years of service, commendations for community work. It's the kind of case where good people can make bad choices, where the line between law enforcement and criminality becomes blurred. Angela nodded, understanding that her husband was grappling with the human dimensions of justice. As a surgeon, she faced similar challenges, decisions that affected lives, choices that carried consequences she couldn't control or predict. "Samuel, you've spent your entire career fighting for justice. Trust your instincts, follow the law, and remember that fairness serves everyone, including people who've made mistakes." Pierce reached across the table and took his wife's hand. "Angela, I need you to know that I take this responsibility seriously, not just the legal aspects, but the moral dimensions. Federal judges have enormous power, and that power has to be exercised with humility and wisdom." They sat quietly for several minutes, comfortable in the silence that long marriage had made possible. Pierce was thinking about the oath he would take every day to administer justice fairly, to protect the Constitution, to serve something larger than his own interests or biases. Across town, defense attorney Marcus Cole was having a very different Sunday evening. He sat in his downtown office, surrounded by case files and legal briefs that represented his last-ditch effort to prepare for what he increasingly believed would be an impossible defense. Cole had spent the weekend researching Judge Pierce, and what he had learned was both reassuring and concerning. Pierce's academic credentials were impeccable, his reputation for fairness was well established, and his judicial philosophy appeared to favor careful adherence to precedent over political ideology. But Pierce was also a former civil rights attorney who had argued cases involving police misconduct, someone who understood the power dynamics that Cole hoped to downplay. Cole's phone rang, interrupting his review of jury selection strategies. The caller ID showed Justin Foster's home number. "Marcus, it's Justin. Just wanted to check in before tomorrow?" Cole could hear the slight slur in Foster's voice that suggested he had been drinking. "Justin, how are you feeling about tomorrow?" "Confident. Ready to tell my side of the story and let the jury see what kind of cop I really am." Cole felt his stomach tighten. Foster's confidence was exactly the problem. He had no understanding of how his behavior appeared to people outside law enforcement, no recognition that his actions required explanation rather than justification. "Justin, remember what we discussed about your testimony. Be humble, be remorseful, acknowledge that you made mistakes even if you believed you were acting appropriately." "Marcus, I appreciate the advice, but I know how to handle myself. I've been testifying in court for 15 years. This is different, Justin. You're the defendant now, not a witness. The jury will be looking for signs that you understand the seriousness of these charges." Foster's voice hardened. "The seriousness? Marcus, the only serious thing here is that federal prosecutors are trying to destroy a good cop's career based on the testimony of criminals and drug dealers." Cole tried a different approach. "Justin, tell me about Judge Pierce. Have you appeared in his court before?" "Never heard of him. Probably some liberal activist judge who hates cops. We'll know as soon as we see him." Cole ended the call feeling worse than when it began. Foster's attitude was going to be catastrophic in court, but there was nothing Cole could do to change a mindset that had been shaped by 15 years of unquestioned authority. Cole returned to his case preparation, focusing on damage control strategies rather than victory scenarios. He would emphasize Foster's service record, his family responsibilities, his contributions to community safety. He would portray the corruption as aberration rather than pattern, mistake rather than choice. But Cole also knew that federal prosecutors were experts at dismantling such narratives, at demonstrating that corrupt behavior reflected character rather than circumstance. And if they had character evidence from recent incidents, Foster's defense would collapse entirely. At 10:30 p.m., Pierce closed his case files and prepared for bed. He had reviewed every relevant precedent, studied the applicable statutes, and familiarized himself with the procedural requirements for tomorrow's trial. He was as ready as preparation could make him. Pierce said his evening prayers with particular attention to the request for wisdom and fairness that had become central to his spiritual life. Tomorrow, he would wield power that could destroy or redeem, that could send a man to prison or return him to his family. Such authority required divine guidance as well as legal training. "Give me the wisdom to see clearly, the courage to act justly, and the humility to serve truth rather than personal preference." Pierce prayed silently. "Help me to be worthy of this trust." As Pierce settled into sleep, his mind drifted to the cases that had shaped his understanding of justice. Civil rights victories that had expanded human dignity, criminal defense work that had protected the vulnerable, academic research that had influenced constitutional interpretation. Tomorrow would add another chapter to that story. Foster was also preparing for bed. Though his prayers were focused on different outcomes, he asked for strength to face his accusers, for wisdom to convince the jury of his innocence, for justice to prevail over politics and bias. "God, you know I've tried to be a good cop, tried to protect people and serve my community. Help me tomorrow to show everyone the truth about who I really am." The irony would have been profound if either man had understood it. Two men praying for justice. Two men believing that truth was on their side. Two men preparing for a confrontation that would test everything they believed about law, morality, and the price of power. Foster fell asleep, dreaming of vindication, of walking out of the courthouse, cleared of all charges, of returning to work with his reputation intact. He dreamed of the respect of fellow officers, the gratitude of a community that understood how much he had sacrificed for their safety. Pierce fell asleep, thinking about the weight of judicial responsibility, about the families that would be affected by tomorrow's decisions, about the precedents that would guide future cases. He dreamed of scales balanced perfectly, of justice administered with both firmness and compassion. Neither man dreamed of the moment that was approaching, the instant when Foster would look up at the bench and see the face of the man he had humiliated, when Pierce would look down and recognize the officer who had forced him to his knees. Neither man could imagine the collision that was coming, the moment when two worlds would meet in a federal courtroom, and truth would emerge from the wreckage of assumptions. Monday morning was 8 hours away. Justice was coming, clothed in the dignity of law and armed with the power of truth. And somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, both men sensed that tomorrow would change everything. They just didn't know how. Monday morning arrived in Charleston with the crystalline clarity that promised either triumph or catastrophe, depending on one's perspective. The federal courthouse stood against the dawn sky like a monument to the idea that justice could be both blind and all-seeing, that truth had a way of emerging from even the most carefully constructed lies. By 6:30 a.m., Judge Samuel Pierce was already in his chambers, arriving early for what would be his first criminal trial as a federal judge. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. Every decision he made today would be scrutinized by Court of Appeals judges, analyzed by legal scholars, and remembered by the attorneys who would appear before him for years to come. Pierce's morning routine was methodical and precise. He reviewed his case notes one final time, checked the federal sentencing guidelines for the charges Foster faced, and studied the biographical information Margaret had compiled on all the attorneys involved in the case. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, a Harvard Law graduate with an impressive record of convicting corrupt public officials. The defense was handled by Marcus Cole, a former prosecutor who had built his career representing police officers accused of misconduct. Pierce poured himself coffee from the elegant silver service that had been a gift from his Georgetown colleagues and settled into the leather chair behind his desk. Through his window, he could see Charleston Harbor in the distance, where Fort Sumter stood as a reminder that federal authority had once been challenged and ultimately vindicated through tremendous sacrifice. At 7:15 a.m., Pierce began reviewing the defendant file for United States v. Old. The name was familiar. He had read it dozens of times over the weekend, but something about seeing it on his Monday morning docket triggered a vague sense of recognition that he couldn't quite place. Pierce opened Foster's personnel file, which included a photograph taken for his police identification card. The image showed a white man in his early 30s, with close-cropped hair, cold eyes, and the kind of aggressive confidence that Pierce had encountered in courtrooms across the country. There was something unsettling about the photograph, something that stirred a memory Pierce couldn't quite access. "Judge Pierce," Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "The court reporter and clerk are ready to begin setting up. Trial is scheduled to start at 9 a.m. Pierce checked his watch and realized he had been staring at Foster's photograph for nearly 10 minutes. There was something about the man's face that bothered him, some half-remembered encounter that hovered at the edge of consciousness. But federal judges couldn't make decisions based on vague feelings, and Pierce pushed the sensation aside as he prepared to don his judicial robes. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Justin Foster was enjoying what he expected to be his last morning as a criminal defendant. He had awakened feeling confident and energized, ready to demonstrate to a federal jury that he was a dedicated police officer who had been falsely accused by criminals seeking revenge. Foster stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his dress uniform for the final time. Every element was perfect. The brass buttons gleamed, the creases were knife-sharp, the medals and commendations spoke of 15 years of dedicated service. He looked like the kind of cop that juries love to acquit, the kind of man who represented law and order in a chaotic world. "You look very handsome," Karen said from the doorway, though her voice carried undertones of anxiety that Foster chose to ignore. "I look like a cop who's been doing his job for 15 years, Foster replied, checking his appearance one more time. "The jury's going to take one look at me and wonder why the federal government is wasting their time prosecuting a good officer." Foster's confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. His uniform projected authority and respectability. His service record included genuine accomplishments, and his demeanor suggested someone who had dedicated his life to protecting others. Federal prosecutors would have to overcome the natural sympathy that many jurors felt for police officers, the assumption that men in uniform deserved the benefit of the doubt. What Foster didn't understand was that his confidence itself had become a liability. Federal prosecutors were experts at demonstrating that corrupt officers often displayed exactly this kind of unshakable arrogance, exactly this inability to acknowledge wrongdoing or show remorse for their actions. At 8 a.m., Foster arrived at Marcus Cole's office for their final strategy session. Cole had been awake since 5:30, reviewing jury selection notes and practicing his opening statement in front of a mirror. The weekend's research had left him more pessimistic than ever about their chances, but professional obligation required him to provide the best possible defense. "Justin, how are you feeling?" Cole asked, as Foster settled into the chair across from his desk. "Ready to get this over with. Ready to show these federal prosecutors what happens when they try to destroy a good cop's reputation." Cole noticed that Foster's confidence had, if anything, increased overnight. The combination of dress uniform and courtroom setting seemed to have convinced him that the familiar dynamics of police testimony would apply to his own trial. "Justin, I need to remind you about something important. When Judge Pierce takes the bench this morning, you need to show him the respect that his position deserves. Federal judges have enormous power, and first impressions matter." Foster nodded dismissively. "Marcus, I've testified in front of dozens of judges. I know how to handle myself in a courtroom. This judge is different. Samuel Pierce is new to the federal bench, highly educated, with a background in civil rights law. He's going to be watching your demeanor very carefully." The name Pierce stirred the same vague recognition in Foster that it had triggered in Pierce himself, but Foster's mind was focused on his testimony rather than judicial backgrounds. He had dealt with liberal judges before, had learned to show them the kind of formal respect that usually neutralized their political biases. "Don't worry about the judge, Marcus. Focus on the jury. They're the ones who matter." At 8:30 a.m., Pierce was joined in his chambers by Chief Judge Harriet Morrison, who had made a special trip to wish him well on his first criminal trial. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the federal bench, appointed by a Republican president but respected across political lines for her fairness and legal acumen. "Samuel, nervous about today?" "More excited than nervous. I've been preparing for this moment my entire career." Morrison studied Pierce's face, noting the careful concentration that she remembered from his confirmation hearings. Criminal cases are different from civil matters. The stakes are higher, the emotions more intense. Defendants sometimes react unpredictably when they realize that their freedom is at stake. Pierce nodded, appreciating the advice. "Judge Morrison, I want you to know that I understand the weight of this responsibility. I won't let personal feelings or political considerations influence my decisions." "I'm not worried about your judgment, Samuel. I'm more concerned about how others will react to your judgment. Federal judges sometimes face hostility from defendants who can't accept that their actions have consequences." Morrison left Pierce to complete his preparations, but her words lingered in his mind. He had studied enough criminal cases to understand that corrupt police officers often displayed particular hostility toward judges who held them accountable, that the uniform sometimes bred a sense of entitlement that made accountability feel like persecution. At 8:45 a.m., the federal courthouse was buzzing with activity as attorneys, court staff, and potential jurors prepared for the day's proceedings. The building itself was an impressive monument to federal authority: marble floors, soaring ceilings, and courtrooms designed to convey the gravity of legal proceedings. Foster arrived with Cole, walking through the courthouse corridors with the swagger of someone who belonged in official buildings. Several attorneys recognized him and nodded respectfully, reinforcing his belief that the legal community understood his value as a law enforcement officer. "Look at this place," Foster muttered to Cole as they walked toward the courtroom. "All this marble and gold, all this expensive architecture. They're trying to intimidate defendants with government power." Cole winced at Foster's casual disrespect for the courthouse. "Justin, federal courtrooms are designed to convey the dignity of judicial proceedings. When you speak in there, you need to show respect for the institution." "I respect the law, Marcus. I just don't respect prosecutors who twist the law to attack good cops." They entered courtroom 3B, a magnificent space with soaring ceilings, dark wood paneling, and rows of benches that could accommodate several hundred spectators. The prosecution table was already occupied by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen and her team, who were arranging documents with the efficient precision of attorneys who had tried dozens of similar cases. Foster glanced at the prosecution team with obvious disdain. "Look at them, Marcus. Government lawyers who've never walked a beat, never faced a dangerous criminal, never put their lives on the line for public safety, and they think they can judge a real cop." Cole was growing increasingly concerned about Foster's attitude. The courtroom was filling with potential jurors, court staff, and spectators who might include journalists covering the trial. Foster's casual hostility toward the prosecution and the federal system could be observed and reported, creating additional problems for his defense. "Justin, I need you to control your expressions and comments. Everything you do in this courtroom can and will be used against you." At 8:55 a.m., Pierce completed his final preparations and prepared to enter the courtroom. He adjusted his robes, checked his notes one more time, and said a brief prayer for wisdom and fairness. His first criminal trial would set the tone for his judicial career, and he was determined to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. Pierce walked through the corridors leading to courtroom 3B, nodding to court staff who had worked with him during his transition to the bench. The bailiff, a veteran court officer named Robert Hayes, fell into step beside him. "Judge Pierce, the courtroom is full. Good crowd for your first criminal trial. Any problems I should know about, Robert?" "Nothing unusual. Defense attorney seems competent. Prosecution team is well prepared. Defendant arrived in dress uniform, typical for police officer trials." Pierce paused outside the courtroom doors, taking a moment to center himself for what lay ahead. Through the glass panels, he could see the crowded courtroom, the attorneys arranging their materials, the potential jurors waiting for the proceedings to begin. "Robert, let's get started." The bailiff opened the doors and stepped into the courtroom. "All rise. The Honorable Samuel Pierce, Judge of the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina, is now presiding." The courtroom erupted in the rustling sound of 100 people rising simultaneously. Attorneys straightened their ties, spectators smoothed their clothing, and potential jurors looked toward the bench with the mixture of curiosity and respect that judicial authority commanded. Pierce entered the courtroom with measured steps, his judicial robes flowing behind him as he approached the bench. He was focused on the procedural requirements of beginning a trial, mentally reviewing the jury selection process that would consume the morning's proceedings. Foster was standing with everyone else, but his attention was focused on sizing up the judge rather than showing respect. He wanted to assess Pierce's apparent political leanings, his likely sympathies, his potential vulnerabilities. Foster had learned over 15 years of testimony that understanding judges was crucial to successful courtroom performance. Pierce climbed the steps to the bench and turned to face the courtroom for the first time. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the crowd of spectators, the jury pool, the prosecution team, and finally the defense table where Marcus Cole stood beside his client. And that's when time stopped. Pierce's gaze landed on Justin Foster, and the carefully maintained professional composure of a federal judge cracked for just an instant. Those were the same cold eyes that had stared at him with hatred in First National Bank. That was the same face that had been inches from his own when racial slurs were whispered with poisonous intent. That was the same man who had forced him to his knees on marble floors while dozens of witnesses watched in horror. Foster was looking directly at Pierce, and his face went through a similar transformation. The arrogant confidence drained away like water through a broken dam, replaced by a kind of terror that came from suddenly understanding that the world was far more connected than he had ever imagined. The professor he had humiliated, the black man he had degraded, the victim he had dismissed as insignificant, was wearing judicial robes and holding a gavel that could destroy his life. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. Two men who had collided in a bank were now facing each other across the most important courtroom in South Carolina, and the power dynamic had been completely reversed. Pierce recovered first, his judicial training allowing him to maintain outward composure even as his mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. Foster continued to stare with the expression of someone who had just seen his worst nightmare materialize in front of 100 witnesses. The courtroom remained standing, waiting for the judge to take his seat and begin proceedings. But in that frozen moment, Pierce and Foster were the only two people who understood that justice had just walked into the room, wearing robes and carrying the full authority of the federal government. Pierce slowly settled into his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured authority of someone who had spent years learning to remain calm under pressure. "Be seated. The court calls the case of United States versus Justin Foster. Will counsel please state their appearances for the record?" Foster remained standing longer than necessary, his eyes locked on Pierce's face, as if he were trying to convince himself that this was all a terrible mistake, a cosmic joke that would be corrected if he just stared hard enough. Marcus Cole noticed his client's paralysis and gently pulled him into his seat. "Justin, sit down. Court is beginning." But Foster barely heard him. His world had just collapsed into a single devastating realization. The man he had humiliated was now the man who would decide his fate. The victim had become the judge, and justice was about to be served by the very person he had tried to destroy. Pierce looked directly at Foster as the attorneys stated their appearances, and in that look was a message that only the two of them could understand. "I remember everything, every word, every action, every moment of what you did to me. And now, Officer Foster, we're going to see what justice really looks like." The collision had finally occurred. The moment that had been building for 4 days was here, and neither man would ever be the same. The silence in courtroom 3B stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it lasted only seconds. In that suspended moment, the carefully constructed worlds of two men collided with the force of absolute truth. Judge Samuel Pierce sat behind the bench with the composed dignity of federal authority, while Officer Justin Foster remained frozen at the defense table, his face drained of color and confidence. Pierce was the first to fully process the implications of what had just occurred. His judicial training kicked in like a well-rehearsed emergency protocol, allowing him to maintain professional composure while his mind raced through the ethical and procedural complexities that now faced him. He could recuse himself from the case, citing a conflict of interest that would delay the trial for months. He could declare a mistrial based on circumstances that couldn't have been anticipated during case assignment. He could acknowledge the obvious problem and let the appellate court sort out the consequences. But Pierce also understood something that Foster couldn't yet grasp. Justice sometimes required exactly this kind of confrontation, exactly this test of character and principle. Foster had brutalized a man he assumed was powerless, someone he believed could be degraded without consequence. Now that same man held the power to determine Foster's future, and the true test of judicial character lay in how that power would be exercised. Pierce made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He would preside over this trial with absolute fairness, would follow the law with meticulous precision, and would demonstrate that justice was blind to everything except truth and evidence. Foster would receive exactly the same fair trial that any defendant deserved, no more, no less. When Pierce spoke, his voice carried the calm authority that had made him one of Georgetown's most respected professors. "Will counsel please state their appearances for the record?" Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen rose smoothly, her professional demeanor unchanged by the obvious tension she could feel, but not yet understand. "Sarah Chen and David Rodriguez, for the United States, Your Honor." Marcus Cole stood more hesitantly, glancing at his client, who remained motionless and pale. "Marcus Cole for the defendant, Your Honor. Pierce nodded formally. Thank you. Before we proceed with jury selection, the court needs to address a preliminary matter. Foster's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Was Pierce going to reveal their prior encounter? Was he going to recuse himself? Was this nightmare about to end before it truly began? The court has been made aware that there may be character evidence related to recent defendant conduct that could be relevant to these proceedings. Mr. Cole, is the defense prepared to address the admissibility of such evidence? Cole looked confused, glancing between Pierce and Foster. As he tried to understand what the judge was referencing, Foster's face went completely white as he realized that Pierce not only remembered the bank incident, but was prepared to allow it as evidence of his character. Your Honor, Cole said carefully, I'm not sure what specific evidence the court is referencing. Pierce maintained perfect judicial neutrality as he responded. Mr. Cole, I'm informed that there may be video evidence of defendant's conduct at a banking establishment last Thursday morning. The prosecution may seek to introduce this evidence to establish pattern of behavior or consciousness of guilt. Foster felt the world tilting beneath him. Not only was Pierce presiding over his trial, but he was apparently prepared to allow the bank humiliation to be presented to the jury as evidence of Foster's character. The victim would sit in judgment, and the crime would be evidence. Chen looked surprised, but quickly recovered. Your Honor, if such evidence exists, the United States would certainly be interested in reviewing it for potential inclusion in our case in chief. Pierce turned his attention directly to Foster for the first time since the recognition. When their eyes met, Foster saw something that chilled him to the bone. Not hatred or anger, but a kind of cold judicial certainty that suggested Pierce had already weighed Foster's worth and found it wanting. Mr. Foster, Pierce said quietly, do you understand the charges against you? Foster tried to speak, but found his voice had disappeared. The confident police officer who had entered the courtroom 30 minutes earlier had been replaced by a terrified defendant who suddenly understood that his actions had consequences he never imagined. Yes, Your Honor, Foster finally managed. Do you understand that you have the right to a fair trial, the right to competent counsel, and the right to be judged solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom? The question was perfectly appropriate, exactly what any federal judge would ask any defendant, but Foster heard it as something else entirely. A promise that he would receive exactly the justice he deserved, administered by exactly the person he had wronged. Yes, Your Honor. Pierce nodded and turned to the jury pool. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the trial of United States versus Justin Foster. The defendant is charged with conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, accepting bribes, and obstruction of justice. These are serious allegations that require careful consideration of evidence and testimony. As Pierce explained the charges and the trial process, several people in the courtroom began to realize that something unusual was happening. Mrs. Jennifer Mills, the ACLU attorney who had witnessed the bank incident, was sitting in the spectator section and had recognized both Pierce and Foster immediately. She was frantically taking notes, realizing that she was witnessing one of the most extraordinary judicial confrontations in federal court history. Detective Maria Santos was also present, having been subpoenaed as a prosecution witness. She had recognized Pierce as soon as he entered the courtroom and understood immediately that Foster's situation had just become impossible. Santos felt a mixture of vindication and pity. Vindication that Foster's racism was finally catching up with him. Pity that any police officer was about to be destroyed so completely and publicly. Margaret Chen, Pierce's clerk, was also beginning to piece together the significance of what was occurring. She had heard about the bank incident through courthouse gossip, had seen the video footage that was circulating on social media, and now realized that her judge was the victim in that viral moment of police brutality. But the person most affected by the recognition was Foster himself, who was experiencing a psychological collapse in real time. Everything he had believed about power, authority, and consequences was being systematically destroyed. The man he had assumed was powerless was wielding ultimate power. The victim he had dismissed as insignificant was now the most important person in his world. Foster's hands began to shake as Pierce continued his preliminary instructions to the jury pool. The judge's voice was calm and professional, but Foster heard menace in every syllable, threat in every pause. This was the voice that had remained calm, while Foster screamed racial slurs, the voice that had complied with every illegal demand, while maintaining dignity under pressure. Cole noticed his client's deteriorating condition and leaned over to whisper urgently, "Justin, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Foster couldn't explain that he had seen something worse than a ghost. He had seen justice personified, wearing robes and holding a gavel that could destroy everything he had ever worked for. "Marcus," Foster whispered back, "we need to talk, right now." Cole shook his head. "We can't interrupt jury selection. Whatever it is will have to wait." But Foster was beyond rational thought. The careful confidence he had maintained for months was crumbling as he watched Pierce conduct the trial with obvious competence and absolute authority. This wasn't the liberal activist judge he had expected to manipulate. This was someone who knew exactly who Foster really was and had the power to ensure that everyone else learned the truth. Pierce began the voir dire process, questioning potential jurors about their ability to fairly consider evidence against a police officer. His questions were perfectly proper and professionally phrased, but Foster heard them as psychological torture designed to maximize his suffering. "Has anyone here had negative experiences with law enforcement that might affect your ability to fairly consider the evidence in this case?" Several hands went up, and Pierce began questioning jurors individually about their experiences with police misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. Each question felt like a knife to Foster, each answer like another nail in his coffin. One potential juror, a middle-aged black woman named Dorothy Williams, spoke about being pulled over repeatedly by police officers who never found any evidence of wrongdoing. "Your Honor, I've been stopped 7 times in the past 2 years, always for fitting a description or driving suspiciously. I try not to let it make me bitter, but it's hard to trust that all police officers are honest." Pierce nodded with obvious understanding. "Miss Williams, do you believe you could fairly consider evidence both for and against a police officer accused of misconduct?" "I believe I could, Your Honor. I know there are good officers and bad officers, just like in any profession." Foster watched this exchange with growing horror. Pierce was assembling a jury that understood police misconduct, that wouldn't automatically defer to law enforcement authority, that might actually hold a corrupt cop accountable for his actions. Another potential juror, a white businessman named Robert Hayes, was questioned about his experiences with federal law enforcement. "Mr. Hayes, do you have strong feelings about federal prosecution of local police officers?" "I believe federal oversight is necessary when local systems fail. Your Honor, if officers are breaking the law, they should face the same consequences as anyone else." Foster felt his stomach drop. Pierce was systematically selecting jurors who believed in accountability, who wouldn't be swayed by uniform worship or reflexive support for law enforcement. During a brief recess, Cole finally had the opportunity to speak privately with his client. They huddled in a corner of the courtroom while other attorneys and spectators milled around during the break. "Justin, what the hell is going on? You look like you're about to have a panic attack." Foster's voice was barely a whisper. "Marcus, that judge, I know him." "You know Judge Pierce? How?" Foster couldn't bring himself to say the words. How could he explain that he had racially profiled, physically assaulted, and illegally arrested the federal judge who was now presiding over his trial? Last Thursday, the bank incident, that was him. Cole stared at his client for a long moment, his legal mind racing through the implications. "Justin, are you telling me that Judge Pierce is the man you arrested at First National Bank?" Foster nodded miserably. "Marcus, we're dead. He's going to destroy me." Cole felt his own stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of the situation. His client hadn't just committed police brutality against a random citizen. He had assaulted a federal judge days before that same judge would preside over his corruption trial. "Justin, this is catastrophic. We need to file for recusal immediately." "On what grounds? That I attacked him? That I forced him to his knees while calling him boy? Marcus, if we reveal what happened, I'm finished anyway." Cole realized that Foster was trapped in a nightmare of his own creation. Revealing the bank incident would force Pierce to recuse himself, but it would also provide prosecutors with perfect character evidence and likely result in additional federal charges for civil rights violations. Justin, we have to assume that Pierce will conduct this trial fairly, despite what happened. Federal judges take their oath seriously. Foster laughed bitterly. Fairly? Marcus, I humiliated that man in front of dozens of witnesses. I called him boy and made him crawl on marble floors. You think he's going to be fair to me? But as the recess ended and the jury selection continued, Foster began to realize something that terrified him even more than Pierce's potential bias. The judge was being absolutely fair. Pierce's questions were legally appropriate. His rulings were procedurally correct, and his demeanor was professionally neutral. Pierce wasn't seeking revenge. He was administering justice, and that justice would be based on evidence, testimony, and law, rather than personal animosity. Foster would receive exactly the fair trial that he had denied to countless defendants over 15 years of police work. As the morning progressed and the jury was finally selected, Foster watched 12 citizens take their oath to fairly consider the evidence. They were a diverse group, black and white, young and old, working class and professional, but united by their promise to judge him based on facts rather than assumptions. Pierce addressed the jury with obvious sincerity. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been selected to hear evidence in a case involving serious allegations against a police officer. Your job is to listen carefully to all testimony, examine all evidence, and reach a verdict based solely on what you learn in this courtroom. Foster listened to those words and realized that Pierce meant them absolutely. The judge, who had every reason to seek revenge, was instead seeking truth. The victim, who could have demanded vengeance, was instead demanding justice. And somehow, that made Foster's situation even more terrifying than if Pierce had been obviously biased. He was going to be judged fairly by the man he had wronged, and that fair judgment would be based on evidence that would almost certainly convict him. As the court recessed for lunch before opening statements, Foster understood that he was facing something worse than a biased judge seeking revenge. He was facing an honest judge seeking truth. And the truth, Foster was beginning to realize, was going to destroy him. The afternoon session began with the kind of electric tension that experienced court reporters recognized as the precursor to legal history. Courtroom 3B was packed beyond capacity, with spectators standing along the walls and journalists from across the southeast crowding the press section. Word had somehow leaked that something extraordinary was happening in Judge Pierce's courtroom, though few observers yet understood the full scope of the drama that was unfolding. Judge Samuel Pierce returned to the bench with the same measured dignity he had displayed all morning, but those who knew him well could detect subtle signs of the enormous pressure he was managing. Margaret Chen, his clerk, had noticed the slight tightness around his eyes during the lunch recess, the careful way he reviewed his notes before each ruling, the extra moment of pause before he spoke. Pierce was walking a legal and ethical tightrope that few judges had ever faced. He was presiding over the trial of a man who had committed a crime against him personally, maintaining absolute fairness, while knowing that every decision would be scrutinized by appellate courts, legal scholars, and a public that was beginning to understand the unprecedented nature of this confrontation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen rose to deliver her opening statement, unaware of the personal drama playing out between judge and defendant, but sensing that the usual dynamics of police corruption trials had been altered in ways she couldn't yet identify. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had convicted dozens of corrupt public officials. The evidence in this case will show that the defendant, Justin Foster, violated the most sacred trust that our society places in law enforcement officers. He took bribes from drug dealers. He provided advance warning about police raids. He used his badge and uniform to protect criminals in exchange for money. Foster sat at the defense table, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Every word of Chen's opening felt like a physical blow. But not because the allegations were false, because they were true, and because the man sitting 10 feet above him knew exactly what kind of person he really was. Chen continued methodically, outlining the evidence that would be presented over the next several days. Financial records showing unexplained deposits into Foster's accounts, surveillance footage of him meeting with known drug dealers, recorded conversations in which he provided information about planned police operations. The defendant will claim that he was gathering intelligence, that he was serving the community by maintaining relationships with informants, Chen said, turning to look directly at Foster. But the evidence will show that Justin Foster was not serving the community. He was serving himself, selling his oath and his integrity for 30 pieces of silver. Pierce listened to Chen's opening with the same careful attention he would give to any prosecutor's presentation. But he was also noting the subtle ways that her characterization of Foster matched his own observations from their encounter at First National Bank. Chen was describing a man who believed rules didn't apply to him, who felt entitled to operate outside legal constraints, who viewed his uniform as a license for whatever behavior served his interests. Marcus Cole rose for the defense opening with obvious reluctance. He had spent the lunch recess trying to convince Foster to accept a plea agreement, but his client remained convinced that his 15-year record of service would somehow overcome the mountain of evidence against him. Ladies and gentlemen, Cole began, Justin Foster is not a perfect man. No police officer is. But he is a man who has dedicated 15 years of his life to protecting this community, who has faced danger that most of us cannot imagine, who has made the streets safer for all of our families. Cole's strategy was to humanize Foster, to remind the jury that police officers operated in a morally complex world, where traditional rules sometimes had to be bent in service of larger justice. But every argument Cole made felt hollow in the presence of Judge Pierce, who represented living proof that some rules, constitutional rights, human dignity, equal treatment under law could never be bent without breaking something essential in the social contract. The government will present evidence that Officer Foster received money from individuals involved in drug trafficking, Cole continued, but they will not be able to prove that he provided anything of value in return, or that his actions were motivated by personal gain rather than legitimate law enforcement purposes. Pierce watched Foster's face during his attorney's opening statement, noting the way the defendant's confidence seemed to flicker between hope and despair. Foster wanted to believe that his uniform and service record would protect him, but he also understood that the man judging him had seen his true character displayed without the protective veneer of official authority. The prosecution's case unfolded with devastating efficiency over the next 2 days. Chen and her team presented financial records that showed Foster had deposited $30,000 in unexplained cash over an 18-month period. They played recordings of Foster providing detailed information about planned police raids to drug dealers who used that information to avoid arrest. They showed surveillance footage of Foster meeting with known criminals in locations chosen specifically to avoid police observation. Each piece of evidence was methodically presented and carefully authenticated. Pierce ruled on evidentiary objections with scrupulous fairness, allowing the defense every legitimate opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case while ensuring that relevant evidence was properly considered by the jury. Foster watched this systematic destruction of his reputation with growing desperation. The evidence was overwhelming, but what made it truly unbearable was the knowledge that Judge Pierce understood exactly what it revealed about his character. The man who had maintained dignity while being racially profiled and physically assaulted was now watching evidence that proved Foster's pattern of corruption, abuse, and contempt for the very laws he was sworn to enforce. On the second day of testimony, Chen called Detective Maria Santos to the witness stand. Santos had been dreading this moment for months, knowing that her testimony would effectively end Foster's career while potentially damaging her own standing within the Charleston Police Department. Detective Santos, Chen began, how long have you been Officer Foster's partner? 2 years, Santos replied, her voice barely audible. During that time, did you observe any behavior that concerned you? Santos glanced at Foster, then at Judge Pierce, understanding suddenly that she was testifying before the man Foster had brutalized at the bank. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being asked to tell the truth about Foster's character to the very person who had experienced that character firsthand. Yes, I observed behavior that concerned me. Can you describe that behavior for the jury? Santos took a deep breath and began describing 2 years of watching Foster escalate encounters unnecessarily, target suspects based on race rather than evidence, and abuse his authority in ways that brought shame to every honest officer in the department. I filed informal complaints about Officer Foster's conduct, but they were dismissed by Internal Affairs. I was told that Foster was a productive officer whose arrest numbers justified his methods. Pierce listened to Santos's testimony with particular attention, understanding that she was describing the systemic protection that had enabled Foster's behavior for years. The same department that had dismissed complaints about racial profiling and excessive force had also ignored evidence of corruption, creating an environment where officers like Foster could operate with virtual impunity. Cole's cross-examination of Santos was gentle but pointed. Detective Santos, despite these concerns, you continued to work with Officer Foster for 2 years. You never filed formal charges, never reported him to federal authorities, never took any action that might have prevented the alleged crimes in this case. Santos's face reddened with shame and anger. I tried to work within the system. I believed that informal complaints and counseling might change his behavior. But they didn't change his behavior, did they? No, they didn't. Pierce watched this exchange with particular interest, understanding that Cole was trying to demonstrate the complexity of police culture, the difficulty that honest officers faced when confronting corruption within their ranks. But Pierce also understood that Santos's testimony actually strengthened the prosecution's case by showing that Foster's misconduct was obvious to his colleagues, systematic rather than aberrant, and protected by institutional indifference. The most devastating moment came when Chen introduced video evidence from Foster's meetings with drug dealers. The surveillance footage showed Foster accepting cash payments, providing written information about police operations, and laughing with criminals about the stupidity of his fellow officers. In one particularly damning recording, Foster could be heard saying, "These federal prosecutors think they're so smart, but they don't understand how real police work gets done. Sometimes you have to get dirty to clean up the streets." Foster watched this evidence with the growing realization that his own words were condemning him. But worse than the evidence itself was the knowledge that Judge Pierce was hearing every detail of his corruption while remembering how he had behaved during their encounter at the bank. The racism, the violence, the casual contempt for human dignity, all of it was being confirmed by the evidence Chen was presenting. On the 3rd day of trial, Chen played her final card, the video footage from First National Bank. "Your Honor," Chen announced, "the government seeks to introduce evidence of defendant's conduct on Thursday morning, 4 days ago, as character evidence demonstrating consciousness of guilt and pattern of behavior." Cole objected immediately. "Your Honor, this evidence is prejudicial and has no bearing on the charges in this case." Pierce faced the most difficult moment of the trial. He could exclude the evidence and protect Foster from additional humiliation, demonstrating that judicial fairness extended even to those who had wronged him personally. Or he could allow the evidence and let the jury see exactly what kind of man they were judging. Pierce made his decision based on law rather than emotion. The objection is overruled. Evidence of defendant's recent conduct is relevant to character and consciousness of guilt. The jury will be instructed to consider this evidence only for those limited purposes. Chen activated the courtroom's video system, and suddenly the marble floors of First National Bank filled the screens. The jury watched in stunned silence as Foster racially profiled a well-dressed black man, escalated a routine encounter into a physical confrontation, and ultimately arrested someone who had done nothing wrong. The most devastating moment came when Foster's voice could be heard clearly. "You don't belong here, boy. Get on the ground now." The racial slur hung in the courtroom air like poison gas. Several jurors visibly recoiled. Foster's face went completely white as he watched his own moral bankruptcy displayed in high definition for the world to see. But what made the moment truly extraordinary was the quiet dignity of the victim in the video, the calm compliance with illegal demands, the maintained composure despite public humiliation, the refusal to be provoked into anger or resistance that would have justified further violence. The jury was watching their judge being brutalized by the defendant, though the formal record would never acknowledge that fact. They were seeing the character of both men revealed in a moment of crisis. Foster's cruelty and racism contrasted with Pierce's dignity and restraint. When the video ended, the courtroom was completely silent. Foster had his head in his hands, unable to look at the jury or the judge. Cole was frantically taking notes, trying to find some way to minimize the damage. Chen was satisfied that the jury now understood exactly what kind of man they were judging. Pierce himself showed no emotion, maintaining the judicial neutrality that separated personal experience from professional responsibility. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said quietly, "you are instructed to consider this evidence only as it relates to the defendant's character and consciousness of guilt. You may not consider it as evidence of the specific charges in this case." But everyone in the courtroom understood that the distinction was meaningless. The video had revealed Foster's true character, and that character explained everything about his willingness to take bribes, provide information to criminals, and corrupt the badge he wore. The prosecution rested its case with devastating effectiveness. Chen had presented overwhelming evidence of Foster's corruption, while also revealing his character through his own actions and words. The jury had seen both his crimes and his soul, and both were found wanting. Cole's defense was brief and hopeless. He called character witnesses who testified to Foster's service record, but their praise rang hollow after the jury had watched him racially profile and assault an innocent man. He presented alternative theories for the evidence, but Foster's own recorded words undermined every argument. When Foster finally took the stand in his own defense, the result was catastrophic. Cole had coached him extensively, but Foster's arrogance and inability to show genuine remorse destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt. "Officer Foster," Cole asked, "can you explain to the jury why you accepted money from individuals involved in drug trafficking?" "I was gathering intelligence," Foster replied, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he had used with Pierce at the bank. "Sometimes law enforcement requires building relationships with criminals. The money was compensation for information I provided about other criminal activities." Chen's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. "Officer Foster, you testified that you were gathering intelligence, but you never filed intelligence reports about these individuals, did you?" Intelligence gathering doesn't always result in formal reports. You never shared this intelligence with your supervisors, did you? Not all intelligence needs to be shared immediately.
Officer Foster, you deposited $30,000 in cash over 18 months without reporting the source to your department, didn't you?
Department policy regarding compensation is complex. Chen played the surveillance footage again, showing Foster laughing with drug dealers and accepting cash payments. "Officer Foster, does this look like intelligence gathering to you?" Foster's face reddened with familiar anger. "You don't understand police work. You've never had to make the kinds of decisions that real cops face every day." "Officer Foster, are you saying that taking bribes from drug dealers is a decision that real cops face?" "I wasn't taking bribes. I was Officer Foster," Chen interrupted. 4 days ago, you racially profiled and assaulted an innocent man conducting business at his own bank. Do you consider that to be the kind of decision that real cops face?" Foster's composure completely collapsed. "That has nothing to do with this case. Doesn't it, Officer Foster? Doesn't it show exactly the kind of man you are? The kind of man who believes rules don't apply to him. The kind of man who would take money from criminals and then claim he was serving justice?" Pierce sustained Cole's objection to the characterization, but the damage was done. Foster had revealed himself to be exactly what the evidence suggested: a corrupt officer who felt entitled to operate outside the law while claiming to serve it. During closing arguments, Chen summarized the evidence with devastating clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard testimony, seen documentation, and watched video evidence that proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Justin Foster is a corrupt police officer who sold his oath for money. But more than that, you have seen what kind of man he is. Someone who believes his badge gives him the right to abuse anyone he considers beneath him." Cole's closing was passionate but hopeless. Justin Foster is not a perfect man, but he is not the monster the prosecution has tried to make him. He served this community for 15 years, faced dangers that most of us cannot imagine, and made mistakes that he regrets. But Foster's own testimony had shown that he felt no regret, no remorse, no understanding that his actions were wrong. The jury had seen him refuse to acknowledge wrongdoing, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Pierce's jury instructions were masterful in their clarity and fairness. He explained the law with precision, defined the elements of each charge with care, and reminded the jury of their obligation to base their verdict solely on the evidence presented in court. Ladies and gentlemen, Pierce concluded, you have sworn an oath to do justice in this case. Justice requires careful consideration of evidence, faithful application of law, and the courage to reach a verdict based on truth rather than sympathy or prejudice. As the jury retired to deliberate, Foster finally understood the full scope of his situation. He was being judged by 12 citizens who had watched him commit crimes, heard him lie under oath, and seen him brutalize an innocent man. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his character was destroyed, and his future lay in the hands of people who now understood exactly what he really was. Pierce had conducted the trial with absolute fairness, but that fairness had been Foster's destruction. The judge who could have sought revenge had instead sought truth, and the truth was going to convict him. The jury deliberated for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, a remarkably short time for a federal corruption case that had consumed 3 days of testimony. But the evidence had been overwhelming, the defendant's character had been thoroughly revealed, and 12 citizens had reached the inevitable conclusion that justice demanded. At 3:47 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, the bailiff received word that the jury had reached a verdict. Within minutes, courtroom 3B was packed with spectators, journalists, and court personnel who understood they were about to witness the conclusion of one of the most extraordinary trials in federal court history. Judge Samuel Pierce entered the courtroom with the same measured dignity he had displayed throughout the proceedings, but those who knew him well could detect subtle signs of the emotional weight he was carrying. This moment would complete a circle that had begun 4 days earlier on the marble floors of First National Bank, a circle of justice that had transformed victim into judge and aggressor into defendant. Justin Foster sat at the defense table, looking like a man who had aged years in a matter of days. The confident police officer who had entered the courthouse on Monday morning had been replaced by a broken defendant who finally understood that actions had consequences, that power was temporary, and that justice sometimes wore robes and carried a gavel. Marcus Cole sat beside his client with the resignation of an attorney who had fought a losing battle against overwhelming evidence and damning character revelations. He had done his professional duty, but no lawyer could overcome the combination of financial records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations, and video evidence that had destroyed Foster's credibility. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen waited with the quiet confidence of a prosecutor who had methodically built an unassailable case. She had proven Foster's corruption with documentary evidence and revealed his character through his own actions and words. Justice was about to be served with mathematical precision. Pierce called the court to order with formal words that carried profound personal significance. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I understand you have reached a verdict. The jury foreman, Robert Hayes, the businessman who had spoken during voir dire about the need for federal oversight of corrupt local officials, stood with obvious gravity. We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff. Pierce accepted the form and reviewed it silently, his face revealing nothing of what he read. But everyone in the courtroom understood that this moment represented more than the conclusion of a single trial. It was a test of whether the justice system could hold its own accountable, whether badges and uniforms provided protection from consequences, whether victims could become judges and still administer fair justice. Will the defendant please rise? Foster stood on unsteady legs, supported by Cole's hand on his arm. For the first time since Monday morning, Foster looked directly at Pierce, and in that moment, both men remembered everything that had brought them to this point: the bank, the racial slurs, the handcuffs, the humiliation. But they also understood that what was about to happen transcended personal history and entered the realm of institutional justice. Pierce's voice carried the authority of law itself, as he read the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of accepting bribes in connection with drug trafficking, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, the jury finds the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom 3 times, each repetition driving home the completeness of Foster's downfall. Guilty of corruption, guilty of betraying his oath, guilty of the pattern of behavior that had been revealed through his treatment of Pierce at the bank. Foster collapsed into his chair as if the verdicts were physical blows. The career he had built over 15 years, the reputation he had cultivated, the future he had planned, all of it was destroyed by those 3 words repeated 3 times. Pierce continued with formal sentencing procedures. But the real drama had concluded with the verdict. Foster would face substantial prison time, would lose his pension and benefits, would be forever branded as a corrupt cop who had sold his integrity for money. But the consequences extended far beyond Foster himself. Detective Maria Santos, who had been watching from the spectator section, understood that the verdict represented a vindication of every complaint she had filed, every concern she had raised, every moment of moral courage she had shown while working with a corrupt partner. Mrs. Jennifer Mills, the ACLU attorney who had witnessed the bank incident, was already drafting press releases that would use Foster's conviction as leverage for broader police reform initiatives. The video of Pierce's dignified response to racial profiling would become a powerful tool for training officers about constitutional rights and human dignity. Margaret Chen, Pierce's clerk, was taking careful notes that would be used in legal scholarship about judicial ethics, conflict of interest, and the administration of justice when judges have personal knowledge of defendant character. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Pierce took a moment to address the broader implications of what had occurred. "Mr. Foster," Pierce said quietly, "you have been convicted by a jury of your peers based on evidence that proved your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. These convictions reflect not only specific criminal acts, but a pattern of behavior that betrayed the trust that our society places in law enforcement officers." Foster looked up at Pierce, and for the first time since the bank incident, his eyes showed something other than arrogance or terror. They showed a flicker of understanding that he had destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of everyone who had trusted him to serve with honor. "The badge you wore and the oath you took were not licenses for personal enrichment or racial prejudice," Pierce continued. "They were sacred trusts that required you to serve something larger than your own interests. You chose to betray that trust, and this verdict reflects the consequences of that choice." Pierce's words were perfectly appropriate for any corrupt police officer, but everyone who understood the full context knew they carried special weight when spoken by someone who had experienced Foster's character firsthand. The formal proceedings concluded with scheduling for sentencing and post-trial motions. But the real story was just beginning. Within hours, video footage of the verdict was being broadcast across the country, with legal commentators analyzing the unprecedented situation of a federal judge presiding over the trial of someone who had committed a crime against him personally. The consensus among legal scholars was that Pierce had handled the situation with extraordinary professionalism, maintaining absolute fairness while allowing the evidence to speak for itself. His refusal to recuse himself had forced the justice system to confront its own principles, and those principles had proven strong enough to withstand the test. 2 weeks later, Pierce conducted Foster's sentencing hearing with the same careful attention to law and precedent that had characterized the trial. The federal sentencing guidelines called for 18-24 months imprisonment, but Pierce also had to consider the aggravating factors revealed during the trial. "Mr. Foster," Pierce said during sentencing, "the evidence presented during your trial revealed a pattern of behavior that extended beyond the specific charges for which you were convicted. Your abuse of authority, your willingness to target citizens based on race, and your fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to serve the public require a sentence that reflects the gravity of your crimes." Pierce sentenced Foster to 36 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release and permanent disqualification from law enforcement employment. The sentence was within legal guidelines but reflected Pierce's understanding that corruption coupled with racism required consequences that would deter other officers from similar conduct. Foster's reaction to the sentence was the final revelation of his character. Instead of showing remorse or accepting responsibility, he stood and addressed the court with the same arrogance that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. "Your Honor, I served this community for 15 years. I put my life on the line every day to protect people who didn't appreciate what I was doing for them. If gathering intelligence from criminals is a crime, then every undercover officer in America should be in prison." Pierce listened to this final display of self-pity and defiance with obvious disappointment. "Mr. Foster, your refusal to accept responsibility for your actions demonstrates that you still do not understand the nature of the trust that was placed in you and the magnitude of how you betrayed that trust." Foster was led away in handcuffs, still muttering about the unfairness of a system that held police officers accountable for their crimes. His final words as he left the courtroom were directed at Pierce. "You got your revenge, Judge. I hope you're satisfied." Pierce responded with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire judicial career. "Mr. Foster, this was never about revenge. It was about justice, and justice has been served." The aftermath of Foster's conviction rippled through the Charleston Police Department like an earthquake. Chief Patricia Williams, who had protected Foster for years through the department's internal affairs process, was forced to resign when federal investigators began examining other cases that Foster had handled. Internal Affairs Sergeant Patricia Reeves, who had dismissed complaints about Foster's conduct, found herself the subject of a Justice Department investigation into systemic civil rights violations within the Charleston Police Department. Detective Maria Santos was promoted to sergeant and assigned to lead a new unit focused on investigating complaints of police misconduct. Her first case was a comprehensive review of every arrest Foster had made over his 15-year career, looking for patterns of racial bias and constitutional violations. The bank incident video, which had been introduced as character evidence during Foster's trial, became a training tool used by police academies across the country. Pierce's calm response to racial profiling and illegal arrest was cited as an example of how citizens should interact with law enforcement, while Foster's behavior was used to demonstrate the consequences of racial bias in policing. 6 months after Foster's conviction, Pierce was invited to speak at the National Conference of Federal Judges about judicial ethics and conflict of interest. His presentation, titled "When Victims Become Judges: Maintaining Fairness in the Face of Personal Experience," became required reading in judicial training programs. "The law demands that judges be impartial," Pierce told his colleagues, "but it does not require that we be ignorant of the human condition. When we have personal knowledge of a defendant's character, we must use that knowledge not to seek revenge, but to ensure that justice is administered with perfect fairness." Pierce's handling of the Foster case became a model for judicial conduct, demonstrating that personal experience could inform judicial wisdom without compromising judicial fairness. Law schools began teaching the case as an example of how the justice system could hold itself accountable while maintaining its integrity. 1 year after Foster's conviction, Pierce received a letter from an unexpected source. Dr. Angela Pierce's patient, a young black man named Marcus Williams, who had been stopped and harassed by police officers multiple times, but had never filed complaints because he believed the system wouldn't protect him. "Judge Pierce," Williams wrote, "I saw the video of what happened to you at the bank, and I saw how you handled the trial of the officer who attacked you. For the first time in my life, I believe that the justice system might actually work for people like me. I'm applying to law school because I want to be part of that system." Pierce kept that letter in his desk drawer as a reminder that justice was not just about individual cases, but about the precedents those cases set, the messages they sent, and the hope they provided to people who had given up on the possibility of fair treatment under law. Foster served 28 months of his sentence before being released on supervised probation. He moved to a small town in rural Georgia, where he found work as a security guard at a shopping mall. His law enforcement career was over, his pension was gone, and his reputation was permanently destroyed. But the most lasting consequence of Foster's conviction was not what happened to him personally. It was what happened to the system that had protected him for so long. The Charleston Police Department was placed under federal oversight, required to implement new training programs on constitutional rights and racial bias. Officers were required to undergo annual testing on appropriate use of force and respectful treatment of all citizens. The federal consent decree that resulted from Foster's case became a model for police reform across the country. Departments that had once dismissed complaints about racial profiling and excessive force were forced to take such complaints seriously, knowing that federal prosecutors were watching and willing to act. Pierce's first year on the federal bench included dozens of other cases, but none as personally significant as Foster's trial. He handled civil rights cases with particular care, understanding from personal experience how constitutional violations affected real people in real situations. 2 years after Foster's conviction, Pierce was walking through downtown Charleston when he encountered Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the bank associate, who had witnessed Foster's attack. She recognized him immediately and approached with obvious emotion. "Judge Pierce, I want you to know that what happened to you at the bank changed me. I've been volunteering with civil rights organizations, trying to help other people who've experienced what you experienced." Pierce smiled with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Hartwell, justice isn't just about what happens in courtrooms. It's about how we treat each other every day, how we stand up for what's right, how we refuse to accept that some people deserve less dignity than others." As Pierce continued his walk through the city where he now served as a federal judge, he reflected on the strange path that had brought him from the marble floors of First National Bank to the federal courthouse. He had been transformed from victim to judge not through any plan or ambition, but through the simple operation of a justice system that sometimes worked exactly as it was designed to work. Foster's conviction had proven that badges and uniforms provided no protection from accountability, that victims could become judges and still administer fair justice, that the arc of justice really did bend toward truth when people had the courage to pursue it. The marble floors of the federal courthouse, like those of the bank where Pierce had been humiliated, would always remind him that justice was not about revenge or personal satisfaction. It was about ensuring that every person, regardless of race or station, received the dignity and fair treatment that the Constitution promised and the law demanded. And in that courthouse, under the authority of law and the weight of judicial responsibility, Judge Samuel Pierce continued to serve justice with the same quiet dignity he had shown when forced to his knees by a racist cop who had no idea that his victim would someday hold his future in his hands. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and the system had proven that it was stronger than the flawed individuals who sometimes tried to corrupt it. The story that had begun with humiliation on marble floors had ended with vindication under the scales of justice. And somewhere in that transformation lay proof that America's promise of equal justice under law was not just an ideal. It was a reality that could be achieved when good people had the courage to demand it.